G'day.
Hey. Oh shit.
Hello. How are you? Can you
Uh
hear me? What's going
oh
on?
wait.
Oh my god.
There, I forgot to plug the fucking thing in.
Cancel everything. It's all
Not
over.
record.
Podcast is cancelled forever. No more podcast.
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you are listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thank you especially to those of you who've taken a moment sometime recently to tell somebody you know about the podcast. If you like it and you know somebody else you think might like it, maybe somebody in your graduate program, maybe a student, maybe a teacher, or maybe just a weirdo from your neighborhood who also likes to complain about poetry, just pass the word along. Let them know they might like Slee Rickets, or at least like getting mad about various things I say. I will be in your debt. This week, Alice from the great podcast Poetry Says joins me again to talk about a few different things, among them a recent New Yorker article about Wendell Berry. I can't even remember the real name of it because her fake name for it is all that's stuck in my head. She also brought in a couple of poems, one by Jack Gilbert called A Brief for the Defense, and one by Dorian Lux, or Lowe. I have no idea how to say your name. Maybe Alice does. We disagree, and maybe we're both wrong. The Dorian Lux's poem is called Anti-Lamentation, and then we also talk about Ilya Kaminsky's poem, We Lived Happily During the War. Spoiler, Alice thinks it's fine, and I can't fucking stand it. But we had a good conversation. We also ended up getting into a few other things, including her partner's recent chess.com addiction and what makes for a good poetry podcast and why there are so few out there. I also I include a little rant I was originally intending to cut, in which I talk shit about another poetry podcast, but it ended up being a little hard to cut around, and I figure I can just ask all of you kindly not to tell those guys about it, because maybe someday I will still try to get one or both of them on for a conversation. Oh, and that cold open I started with, I kept that audio exclusively because it was the first and perhaps only time I've ever caught Alice on tape saying "g'day." So I just couldn't let it go. So
Yeah.
I listened to your interview with Cassandra Atherton this
Oh, lovely.
afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah, super frustrating. Super frustrating. I mean, she was so good when talking about gender, like really smart and like reasonable and thoughtful about gender, and also wonderful on. She apparently teaches a class called Classics and Trash, and her whole take on that was terrific. And like I am. I love. I mean, first of all, I love blending highbrow with lowbrow, but I also am really glad for people to remember that anything we think of solemnly as great work today was almost certainly treated as accessible pop culture at the time, and maybe even treated as something disposable. So I thought all of that was so good, and yet
And
the,
yet,
the topic that she had been brought in for, that she was the expert on, that she had written a book about, prose poetry, I thought she was terrible on. I thought I came into that interview thinking prose poetry was a more substantial subgenre of poetry than I left thinking it. I was like, leaving it, I was like, oh, prose poetry is bullshit. Like it was, I was just like baffled. I didn't, like, I mean, like, you know, I think like there's a prose poetry tradition. There's some really good prose poetry. And like, as with most traditions in the arts, it's largely a matter of like one person having seen someone else do something, say like, hey, there's sort of there's something interesting about the tone and the register that shifts a little bit when you move into this other shape, and maybe like I kind of like what this guy's doing, and I'll do something a little, so you see a through line with Baudelaire and Eliot and Russell Edson and what's his name, what's the guy who did No Planet Strike, the American guy. You see, like there's some good, or like Joe Winderoth, like there's some good prose poetry, but like everything she had to say was about typography, and I just thought like is typography that important? Like I think of typography as being like typography is like a disposable outer garment. It's like those baggies you put over your galoshes when you walk inside so you don't get water on the floor. Like typography is so silly. It just seems like you have a whole like critical perspective that's like grounded on typography. It just seems crazy.
Oh boy, we're how, 5 minutes
hard am I
in,
making,
guys.
How hard am I making?
We're 5 minutes right in, and Matthew's just like going for it. To be fair to Cassandra,
please be fair.
I went into that interview very much skeptical of prose poetry. I don't know that I had any very good questions for her. So I wonder if, because when you actually get into the stuff she's written about prose poetry, there's definitely more to it. I guess I didn't.
It's a whole book, so I assume, yeah.
It's a whole book, yeah. So I didn't go deeply into it because my understanding of it is fairly surface level. I think that is one of the, I said at the start of that episode, like I'm not an expert on many, many things. That's the disadvantage when you go to interview somebody who is an expert, is that if you're not an expert, you just end up asking really basic questions. But yeah, I mean, good point. She did point to the typography as one of the main features. That is true.
Withering diplomacy from Alice Allan. Do you have any pot shots you'd like to take at any of my recent guests?
Pot shots. Now look, your last interviewee, you and he were talking a lot about how metrical formal poetry doesn't get a good run.
This is Ahmed Majmudar, yeah.
Yes. And I've heard this before. I've heard it many, many times. As a free verse poet, I guess, who has been dabbling a little bit around the edges of metrical formal poetry because they've been corrupted by the inimitable Joshua Megan, I think you have to admit that you've had enough time. Come on, how many centuries have you had, guys?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Sure. Like from a larger historical perspective, has formal verse been the dominant mode when contrasted to free verse? Totally, absolutely. In fairness, free verse didn't exist for most of that time. So since free verse started existing, I do think that it has become the dominant mode. And, I think to me, like the more interesting question in all that was not like, why are people so mean to formal poets? But like, so why free verse has become so dominant, like why it is so widely adopted, and we talked a little bit about that, and he had some theories about it. I am my primary skepticism or resentment about it today is just that, like, I don't think, like, it's my dad would say, like, why don't you, I love classical Greek architecture. Like, I would never try to like design a Parthenon today. Like, why don't you do something modern? Why don't you write in a way that, like, if everybody's moved on, why don't you move on too? And, I guess my response is partly like, well, the reason that we do modern architecture and not the Parthenon is not just because styles have changed. It's also because, like, we like things like windows and insulation and like lighter building materials that allow us to build higher, and 100 other things. And maybe we do lose some, just as we like lose something in classic car design when we make cars safer. But like there is a clear advantage there. And the advantage with free verse, like, I don't know, is there an advantage beyond having some airbags to guard you from embarrassment? Like, is there, or just like to make it easier? Like, is there, let me put it this way. Free verse is not more popular because it sounds better.
Oh,
well, no, I'm
fired.
not saying it always sounds worse. Oh no, I'm not saying it always sounds worse. I'm not saying formal verse always sounds better. Of course not. But it's not like there's an obvious musical advantage that free verse has. It's not like, oh man, that's shit. That's really nice. Like, I don't, so if there's
Sounds more like real people talking and saying actual things.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, I'd say like the primary aesthetic advantage free verse has is that it is closer to natural speech. Like as Austin said, like it's not like this is a civil rights issue. It's not like it's a major fight to wage. But I just think it's hard to argue that. Like I think it's very easy to say, "Shut up, formal poets, stop whining." I think it's very hard to say, "Shut up, formal poets, you're wrong about this."
Yeah, you're not wrong. And look, I had to concede what you guys were saying about the advantages of free verse being it's easier. Like, it is easier. Holy fuck, it's hard to write in meter, like, and rhyme. Oh my god, it's so hard.
Well, and maybe it's more fun to wear like a denim jacket than it is to wear a tuxedo. So like it's just by virtue of being informal, it's more comfortable in some ways. It's less. You call less attention to yourself. You can go hang out. It's harder to hang out in a villanelle.
It is harder to hang out in a villanelle. I mean, it'd be nice if there was just no prejudice though among editors and readers. It'd be nice if they could all just sit comfortably next to each other. I've been reading the journal that is very kindly sent by the editor of 32 Poems, and really enjoying getting that glimpse into a totally different corner of poetry in the US right now. And very, very, like, maybe no formal poetry in there that I could see so far.
Well,
maybe I've just missed
no.
it.
No. And I don't know which issue you have, because I think he sent you some back issues as well, and he's because there's some trouble sending current issues for whatever legal reasons. But
yes, sorry about that.
But no, I was just going to say that 32 Poems has a reputation among formal poets for being unusually friendly and open to form.
Oh, okay, all right. So I just haven't got to them yet.
Well, I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying, like, even in a magazine that's particularly friendly and open to formal poems, you might have none in a given issue. That's the balance. But let's get to what you wanted to whine about today.
Wendell fucking Berry. How do you live with him, with the shadow of this guy just constantly hovering around? He's written 52 books.
Yeah.
The writer of this profile, I'm still reading The New Yorker, I'm so sorry. There's this profile in here, Wendell Berry's advice for a cataclysmic age. Yeah. There is no advice in this article at all. The article should be called...
Other than the sort of insane, extremely megalomaniacal advice, which you will get if you go to the Wendell Berry School for Farming, or whatever the fuck it's called, which is be like Wendell Berry. Like that's the only...
Be like Wendell Berry.
The closest thing to advice you get anywhere in this article. Yeah.
Yeah, it should be called My Dad Knows Wendell Berry.
Yep.
Yeah. The closest it probably gets to advice, and this is not really much to do at all with poetry, and it's a lot to do with politics, so feel free to just cut this bit. He quotes Wendell Berry as saying, if two neighbours know that they may seriously disagree, but that either of them, given even a small change of circumstance, may desperately need the other, should they not keep between them a sort of prepaid forgiveness? They ought to keep it ready to hand like a fire extinguisher. So he's talking there about, obviously, Trump voters that he lives near.
Yeah.
He is not a conservative. Well, I mean, he is pretty conservative, but maybe not as politically
he's an
conservative.
Agricultural conservative for sure. He's but no, I mean, he tends to be very progressive on questions of race and gender and rights and
Yeah, but I guess I wonder, reading a sentence like that, how much does that rile you? Because when I listen
Read
to
me
a
the
lot.
sentence again.
So it's like if two neighbors know they may seriously disagree, so you're living next to a Trump voter,
Sure.
but that either of them, given even a small change of circumstance, may desperately need the other.
Yeah.
So like there's a natural disaster or whatever, you
Sure.
need something. Should they not keep between them a sort of prepaid forgiveness? They ought to keep it ready to hand like a fire extinguisher. And I just wonder how much people in the US have just moved beyond that. Just gotten to a point where they're like, I don't care if I need your fire extinguisher.
I'm not riled by that statement, except that I do think prepaid forgiveness is a remarkably ugly and postmodern construction for Wendell Berry to be using. But
Yeah,
yeah, I think
interesting.
that the suggestion that people of different classes and political points of view would be better off in many ways if they lived closer together and had and shared communities and neighborhoods and like local interests. I think that's almost inarguably true. And like here's I'll say I don't know. I've read almost no Wendell Berry. I've I know him mostly. I think his reputation at the moment is largely founded on what it seems to be founded on in this article, which is his perspective on agriculture and modernity, rather than say like the quality of his novels or his poems. I have not read a Wendell Berry poem that blew me away. Most of them feel like tiny essays, some more sentimental than others. Nothing really like remarkable in the sound or the construction. Again, like I've read very little, but my perspective on him, my ill-founded perspective on him before reading this article, was mostly that I thought of him as a kind of a monk or a saint, where he goes off and he lives in a way that like, would we all be better off if we lived like that? Probably, but like very few other people are going to live like that, and so like good on him. But I think like maybe this is an Australia US thing. Like we are so unlikely to show tolerance across political disagreements, and we're so unlikely to give the slightest shit about the environment, that the fact that he's sort of bossy and outspoken about both those things maybe doesn't rub people the wrong way as much over here, because he's a little bit more of a voice in the wilderness, no pun intended.
Right, right. It's like an alien talking
Right.
to you.
Like it's sort of
Yeah.
nice to know that he's out there doing his Wendell Berry thing because nobody else is. And like,
Mm.
you know, again, like I've not encountered a piece of writing from him that blew my mind. I'm sure there are lots of people who are smarter than I am greatly admire him. So I don't contest that. But like reading this article, I thought mostly that like he is surprisingly more tolerant of the moral compromises one makes when, say, like helping out with a tobacco harvest, than he was of the moral compromises one makes when, say, living in a city. That I just
Yeah.
thought, like, I kind of wanted to say to him, like, yeah, you see how you have to kind of balance things and make a reasonable decision and take into account the lived realities of the people around you, and like, you're not going to be pure, but you're going to generally be doing good things for people. Like, that's kind of the way most people try to live. I think most people are lazier than he is, but he's just like, he's an old man who's got a very particular vision of things in his head, and like, okay, fine. But I don't know. Again, like, I can't think of a poet I know of who has in my presence pointed to a poem of his and said, this inspired me.
Yeah, no, I hadn't read any until I sat down to get ready to record with you, and I was like, oh fuck, I was meant to have read some Wendell Berry poems. And then I skimmed a few. I was like, yeah, okay, this is exactly what I thought it would be.
Yeah.
I think this is interesting, less for Wendell Berry and more for the fact that this article exists. Why do we keep going to this kind of thing? It's this weird sort of left-leaning self-flagellation where we're like, if only I could be so good, if only
Yeah.
things could just be simple, and then I could love my neighbor, and I would love to get back to the land. And then you turn around and order something off Amazon, and
Right. Yeah,
it's
you don't
just
actually do
indulging
anything. You
in,
don't actually
yeah,
change
you're just
anything.
indulging in your guilt. And that's what all these poems that I sent you as well, I feel like they're doing the
Yep.
same thing, just allowing you a little moment to, I guess, wallow, to just feel like, I
Yeah.
am
Oh,
terrible,
yeah.
aren't I? Ugh, I'm so terrible.
Oh,
Anyway,
no, I'm totally with you there. Maybe the one other wrinkle that comes up in looking at Wendell as an American is that he brings to the public conversation some very left leaning politics associated with an attitude toward agriculture and technology that was kind of probably most famously voiced by a group of writers known as the agrarians, and they were associated with some very good poetry and some very questionable politics.
oh yeah,
Yeah, they were
what was
like,
that?
there's a famous book called "I'll Take My Stand,"
Mm-hmm.
which is a book of some very smart essays, some of which are also some very racist essays. Or like, "I'll Take My Stand" to give you a to give you some idea of the perspective of the writers is a line from Dixie, right? In Dixieland, I'll take my stand.
Ah,
Yeah, which
okay.
sorry, Dixie is the unofficial anthem of the Confederacy. It was actually
Ah,
written by a New Yorker, but that's a different story. So like Robert Penn Warren, who later apologized for this essay and later like did a lot of work for civil rights and wrote many things and is definitely a multitude. In I'll Take My Stand, getting some pressure from his friends, he wrote an essay called "The Briar Patch," which argues against integration of schools. The argument he makes is it ends up actually being an argument about industrialists using race to divide and conquer the working class, but he still says, so let's pause integration. And that's pretty bad. So like this perspective that says, hey, let's go back to the land and be farmers was mostly associated, especially among like men of letters, was mostly associated with the agrarians. And so Wendell Berry sort of allows that to have a slightly different embodiment as a perspective. And that seems less bad than good. But again, I think it's the response of people like the my dad knew Wendell Berry person. Was that a man or woman? I can't remember. The author of the
Dorothy Wickenden,
article,
yeah.
Dorothy, what's her name? That's more. That's just rubbing the hem of his garment and letting a little bit of his wholesomeness rub. The shine come off on you, and to say, "Wow, boy, he's great. Now I'd like a large frappuccino." Yeah, that's you're right. Like that's all the same thing as the self-flagellating poems. The self-flagellating poems, in particular, that you pointed to. Did you want to talk about these at all?
I would love to. Yes, there. I have to come clean though and
Okay.
say that two of them have featured previously on Poetry Says, my podcast.
Aha.
Anti-Lamentation by Dorian Lowe, I've talked about twice, I found out.
Wow.
And A Brief
Okay.
for the Defence by Jack Gilbert, I had a guest on who, actually, my first and possibly, yeah, one of the first times I ever got to interview a poet in the US. He brought this poem along and had reservations about it. That interview was in early 2016. It blows my mind how differently the poem reads now.
Mm.
So,
So
and
why
then
why
we've
why
also
does
got,
it? You sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
and we've also got We Lived Happily During the War, which is apparently doing the rounds again.
Yeah. I know I had heard about that poem and people liking it, and then I only read it recently, and boy, it's irritating as shit. Um, so what is so? I'm curious about. Do you want to read Anti-Lamentation so people know what we're talking about?
Yeah. All right. So this is Anti-Lamentation, Dorian Lowe. I don't know when it was published.
Yeah.
And
Don't
like I
see
said,
it on here.
I've had some time for this poem in the past, and I don't know that I hate it now. I'll be interested to hear how much you hate it. Anti-Lamentation. Regret nothing. Not the cruel novels you read to the end just to find out who killed the cook. Not the insipid movies that made you cry in the dark in spite of your intelligence, your sophistication. Not the lover you left quivering in a hotel parking lot, the one you beat to the punchline, the door, or the one who left you in your red dress and shoes, the ones that crimped your toes. Don't regret those. Not the nights you called God names and cursed your mother, sunk like a dog in the living room couch, chewing your nails and crushed by loneliness. You were meant to inhale those smoky nights, over a bottle of flat beer, to sweep stuck onions across a dirty restaurant floor, to wear the frayed coat with its loose buttons, its pockets full of struck matches. You've walked those streets 1,000 times and still you end up here. Regret none of it. Not one of the wasted days you wanted to know nothing, when the lights from the carnival rides were the only stars you believed in, loving them for their uselessness, not wanting to be saved.
Sorry, what?
I'm just like imagining how much you hate this. You've travelled this far on the back of every mistake, ridden in dark-eyed and morose, but calm as a house after the TV set has been pitched out the upstairs window. Harmless as a broken axe, emptied of expectation. Relax. Don't bother remembering any of it. Let's stop here, under the lit sign on the corner, and watch all the people walk by.
Yeah. So how did you read this in 2016?
I read it as a good poem to offer to people who were first approaching poetry. There's very little work that it asks the reader to do, and I thought it had a pretty good message. I thought it did what it needed to do pretty well. Reading it again now, I'd probably chop the last third off, and just leave it as you've walked those streets 1,000 times and still you end up here. She's basically done at that point. She doesn't really need the rest of it. But it didn't seem too offensive to me at the time.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think that is a better ending. Yeah, I don't hate this. I hate this poem least of the three.
Okay.
Yeah, this poem doesn't especially in isolation, doesn't drive me up the wall. It does a little bit of the trick that like Sam Harris types are always doing, which is like regret nothing or you'll regret it. Like free will doesn't exist, so you better start acting like, well, like, okay. So it feels a little like it's indulging in a lot of should for being a poem ostensibly about letting go of, psychological limitations. I think it feels, before it just becomes a litany, it feels a little bit like a sort of a low calorie alternative to a Carl Dennis poem. But part of what I enjoy about his poems so much is that the argument progresses and shifts. And
yeah. Oh my God.
And this one kind of stays put and then starts to get a little sappy toward the end.
It's that new allegiances thing.
Yeah. No, right, exactly. And in Carl Dennis is partly, his poetry is I love Carl Dennis, so I certainly don't want to dismiss him, but I would say, like, if his poetry is an imitation of anything, it's an imitation of Horace, who had similarly level-headed but also meandering poems that sort of started in one place and ended in a very different place. And that's part of what I do like about the idea of ending the poem at you end up here. That doesn't feel as much like its advice has been rounded off and come to a conclusion. But sorry, go ahead.
She's given you the advice by that point. So. Yeah. So I think I brought this up as a getting into poetry. Here's an on ramp.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
And that's true. I think that's fair. Yeah. A lot of her poems that I've read feel that way. Like they're perfectly inviting and don't offer much friction along the way. And that is not a terrible thing in the beginning.
Okay. All right. Well, Dorian can
Anti-Lamentation's is not a great title, but that's fine. Whatever. It's fine.
Yeah. Shouldn't it just be Anti-Lament?
Yeah, or just maybe just like not a neologism, like maybe just like a word, or but that's fine.
All right, so we got some edits. We got some.
Yeah,
Got some
it's
notes.
like A. Stallings has a poem, a wonderful poem, on the back of her second book, In Lieu of All Blurbs, and the poem is called Anti-Blurb. And like the poem is so good, but then the title's so weird and dumb that like I don't know, the anti let's skip it. All right, so then you also sent me A Brief for the Defense by Jack Gilbert.
Yes, which I also couldn't figure out when this came out, but it feels a lot more important when this came out.
It was it was published on Poem a Day in 2016. In the summer of 2016. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
That's interesting. Yeah, and that's when I did that interview. So maybe that poem wasn't at all significant to that guy. He just pulled it off. Okay, A Brief for the Defense. And another reason that I'm really interested in poems like these is that you just don't get these in Australia. Like,
Okay.
yeah.
And I want to hear more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Here we go. Sorrow everywhere. Slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else. With flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Otherwise the mornings before summer dawn would not be made so fine. The Bengal tiger would not be fashioned so miraculously well. The poor women at the fountain are laughing together because the suffering they have known and the awfulness in their future, smiling and laughing while somebody in the village is very sick. There is laughter every day in the terrible streets of Calcutta, and the women laugh in the cages of Bombay. If we deny our happiness, resist our satisfaction, we lessen the importance of their deprivation. We must risk delight. We can do without pleasure but not delight, not enjoyment. We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. To make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. If the locomotive of the Lord runs us down, we should give thanks that the end had magnitude. We must admit there will be music, despite everything. We stand at the prow again of a small ship anchored late at night in the tiny port, looking over to the sleeping island. The waterfront is 3 shuttered cafes and 1 naked light burning. To hear the faint sound of oars in the silence as a rowboat comes slowly out and then goes back is truly worth all the years of sorrow that are to come.
Yeah.
So I came up with a new theory for this.
Okay, yeah. I want to hear.
I think that this poem is actually saying the opposite of what it sounds like.
Okay. Can you elaborate?
Especially when it gets to
paraphrase its seeming argument.
Its seeming argument is there in the middle of the poem. If we deny our happiness, we resist our satisfaction, we lessen the importance of their deprivation. So if we're going to go around self-flagellating, feeling guilty and not enjoying things, then that is, as he puts it, to praise the devil. It somehow lessens the suffering of others. Yeah.
I don't know if you ever, it doesn't lessen the suffering of others, it diminishes the suffering of others.
Diminishes,
So I don't know if you ever went through this in Australia, but there was definitely a period, like in the wake of 9/11, when there were like a million arguments that had the basic formula, like, if we stop playing Pinochle now, the terrorists have won. And this feels a little bit like it's got some of that energy to it.
The terrorists of one is a joke in Australia.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's familiar enough. Yeah. So that's what this seems to be saying, but you think it's making an ironic counterpoint.
Well, I wonder either that or maybe reading it now, it feels like it has to do that 180 turn. Otherwise, it's just horrible. Like maybe he's saying the sound of a rowboat is not worth all those years of sorrow. Nothing can make up for this suffering, actually. You can pretend that you can go on with your life and that you're ignoring these terrible scenes and dying children and all this stuff. And you can pretend that honouring your own delight and pleasure is somehow valuable, but actually it's not. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. It's a little like it's sort of like the literalizing of one of those hyperbolic expressions of enthusiasm people say. With it's like, well, I'd give my eye tooth for blah blah blah, or like I'd give my left
Mm.
nut for the, and like it's almost like it ends saying like, and all of the joy of that cheesecake was worth the loss of your left nut. It feels like, well, that's not really how that rhetoric. Like it's sort of like a device in the moment. That's not,
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
it sounds that way now. We're
yeah,
constantly brought into direct contact, live stream contact with suffering. And so to turn around and say, well, it's really important that you enjoy your life, though.
yeah.
It's like you couldn't possibly be saying that, surely.
Right. I mean, because up until the poor women at the fountain are laughing together between the suffering they have known, up until there, the beginning of the poem could very easily be a satire of that perspective. Like
Yes,
sorrow
that's
everywhere,
sort of what I'm
slaughter
getting at.
everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else with flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Otherwise, the mornings before summer dawn would not be made so fine. The Bengal tiger
Yeah,
would not be fashioned so miraculously well, which is a little
yeah.
bit of a nod to William Blake, I guess. Yeah, so it feels like, is it a parody of that, or it's not a parody, a satire of that perspective? But then I think that the sentence, there is laughter every day in the terrible streets of Calcutta and the women laugh in the cages of Bombay, like I don't think that's ironic. I think that's
Yeah, no,
straightforward.
you're probably right. But it's funny because when I read it just then, I think, yeah, that line, but we enjoy our lives, it kind of comes off as casual. Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because that's what
it's
God,
fine.
it's the because that's what God wants part that
Yeah,
feels
yeah,
like 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 I mean like it's making fun of like a certain kind of do y'all have prosperity gospel churches in Australia?
yeah. We probably do.
Yeah, like where people will, preachers will say that if you get on the right side with God, if you get right with God, then God will give you money, and so you should give me
Mm,
money to show that you're investing and believing in God. Like just like a straightforward grift, just the real most
mm.
despicable kind of abuse of religion. And this, yeah, like that feels a little bit like we should really enjoy our lives while all these babies are being slaughtered because that's what God wants. Uh, yeah, I mean, this poem is sort of like the opposite of the Ilya Kaminsky poem, and they're both
Yeah.
sort of insufferable because this one is saying, for a poem that is about joy and laughter, it's so unfunny, it's so self-serious, and it feels
Mm.
like it's wagging a finger and saying, we must enjoy ourselves, it is so important. And again, like that's an argument that maybe you could make I was going to say maybe you could write an essay about it. It probably doesn't deserve an essay. You could write a tweet about it.
Can you imagine the backlash, though, if you jumped on Twitter and were like, I think it's really important that we go for brunch, though.
Yeah, like again, like the problem with making that argument even on Twitter is like the truer expression of that argument would be going to brunch. Rather than like stating it on Twitter is almost stating something else, you know.
Mm, mm.
Like let's have a fight. Let's have a pretend fight online. In the Ilya Kaminsky poem, we were happy. Let me find it. We were happy during the war. We lived happily during the war, which was published several years ago in 2013, but then has been made viral again during the Ukrainian, the war in Ukraine. I'll just read it quickly. It's pretty short. And when they bombed other people's houses, we protested, but not enough. We opposed them, but not enough. I was in my bed. Around my bed, America was falling. Invisible house by invisible house by invisible house. I took a chair outside and watched the sun. In the 6th month of a disastrous reign, in the house of money, in the street of money, in the city of money, in the country of money, our great country of money, we, forgive us, lived happily during the war. So it's sort of it is, insofar as it has a, not stated but heavily implied should, it should is the opposite of the Jack Gilbert should.
Mm.
Like, we should live miserably during the war, like, seems to be kind of the argument. And as with the Gilbert poem, like, I mean, this one doesn't even bother to do much of the, like, image building or song weaving work that one might do in writing a poem. It almost is just a naked argument. It's insufferable, I think, for mostly the same reason, and maybe I hate it even more in its virality, because it's a poem where, like, so you asked a question in our exchange earlier that I think I want to hear what you have to say about it, and I'm curious about it too.
Okay.
You asked this question. We'll go back a little bit, and we'll start with, what is this earnest simplicity thing you guys have going? Am I imagining it? Do lots of poets over there shudder at the mention of writers like the above? What earnest simplicity thing do you mean exactly?
Well, when I say that, I'm not thinking of Ilya Kaminsky as much as I'm thinking of Gilbert and Lowe and Mary Oliver.
Yep.
And
the Dorian Lex poem definitely has a little bit of the, like, you don't have to be good feel to it, like Mary Oliver's.
You do not have to be good. Poems that yoga teachers could read to you while you were in your final shavasana, and you could walk out of there being like, I do not have to be good. I feel so much better.
Yes.
Comfort poems, comforting poems.
Yeah, comfort poems. Maybe a certain kind of comfort poem, because I think comfort has a lot of different. Comfort can look and sound like a lot of different things in poetry, and I think writing things that genuinely comfort people is not the worst thing in the world. Part of what is grating to your Australian ear, is part of it that these poems seem to encourage complacency.
Not complacency. I feel that they are dishonest.
Okay. So
one of the things that my partner and I noticed when we were in the US was that there's a lot of strongly worded enthusiasm for things that are kind of okay.
Sorry, what do you mean?
Like, this is fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, like just so.
Yeah, it's like,
right,
all right, mate, it's fine, I guess, but like everything is so, it's not just amusing, it's hilarious. It's not fine, it's great.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And that meant we found ourselves doing a lot of translating, a lot of like, do they mean that they actually do want to see us again? Or were they just saying like, it'd be so good to catch up again? That kind of thing. Yeah. But in terms of the poems, look, for me, one of the most exciting and interesting things that a poem can do is to complicate, is to point to a rough edge, is to ask a question and not make a conclusion. And I feel that there's a willingness in the American poetry that I have read to come to that conclusion, to round off the rough edge, to make a statement that comforts, and in doing that, ignore a few things. There's a willingness to indulge in the beautiful. I see that even in the 32 poems that I've been reading. These lines that are just so gorgeous. Yeah. So gorgeous. And you think, like, when the poet hit on that, they must have been so happy. But part of me is reading it going, oh, yeah, it's very pretty, isn't it, mate? Yeah. I think we're pretty quickly infected with whatever you guys have got, right? Like, so that new school of confessionalism, yeah, it's definitely, it's in us, it's coming up. And
then you also asked, like, not only what is with us, and the Kaminsky poem is not the same, but I think mostly because it's taking up a different end of the argument, and because it doesn't bother to be pretty or comforting. Whereas the Dorian Lux poem and the Jack Gilbert poem both have some prettiness and some comfort to them. The Ilya Kaminsky poem is just sort of this raw, finger-wagging or self-flagellating argument. We were so happy while people were being so bad. Or, I am baffled by the invisible house line. I don't know what is an invisible house. Why would the houses be invisible? Is that because you were just thinking about them while you, like, thinking about houses that were out in the world while you were on Twitter?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Like, well, how are they invisible? What does that mean? but I don't think it's all that different in. I think like its failures are not all that different. It's just that they're taking up the other end of they're taking up the opposing argument, and I think people like to. The reason something like this goes viral is that people like endorsing an expression of their own people. A certain subclass of people like to publicly endorse an expression of self-flagellation as a way to. I mean, the same. I'll go ahead and alienate a bunch of your listeners here. Like the same people who would like really take up the fight and really make a big deal out of saying that the expression "Hey guys" excludes women, or saying like it's really important that we make a land acknowledgement while also not giving land back to anybody. Like I think that this is an expression of a socially acceptable and sometimes even required self-flagellation that is extremely low cost to the self-flagellator, and that's why this sort of thing is popular. Why do people keep wanting poetry to change the world, even though it's the least effective tool for the job? And I think the short answer to that is that the least effective tool is also the tool that requires the least effort to use.
Yeah. No, that's God. You've absolutely nailed it. That's it, and that's why it is so stomach turning. When, I mean, look, we lived happily during the war. I'm not against this poem. I'm fine with it. It's it is a little bit confusing with the invisible houses, but I'm okay with it as a poem. But as soon as it gets thrown into that spotlight and everybody's liking it and talking about it, there's just this sense of like, okay, well, I really hope you did something else today about this. And I know that Ilya Kaminsky is, like, in his interviews about this poem, he's like, yeah, cool, my poem's going viral. I'm on the phone to my friends in Ukraine and sending them money and trying to organize that they have food and stuff. I hope that everybody else is too.
Sure, yeah. And in that way, it feels like if this is a poem that stirs people to meaningful political action, great. I do think from an aesthetic perspective, it's sort of like you're sort of burning the poem. You're sacrificing the poem to a maybe more important cause, because I don't think it's successful as a poem. Like I think you're making a decision to do poetry that is not necessarily good poetry, but that has a good effect outside of poetry. And that's fine and good, but as Cleanth Brooks would say, like there are lots of other things that are worth talking about. Poetry is also a thing worth talking about. And it can have its own purpose. And this is a poem that says that purpose isn't all that important. So over last weekend, maybe it was the Sunday edition, Alyssa Gabbert published this sort of odd multimedia piece on Musée des Beaux-Arts. Did you see this?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So well done.
I mean,
Loved
just
it.
like very, very, very cleanly designed by whoever did the design for it. It's very like extremely accessible. She does some goofy Alyssa Gabbert stuff in there that she always does, but I think overall it's quite a good introduction to Musée des Beaux-Arts. Like I was glad to read it, and I'm glad for other people to read it, and for that poem, which is a wonderful poem, to get a little bit more attention. But it also it reminded me why poems like this and the Jack Gilbert are so lame, because those poems are saying, hey, here's a thing that happens in the world where some people are suffering and other people are not suffering, and then they say, you should do this or you should do that, and the Auden poem just beautifully depicts that condition and arouses some feeling of tension or poignancy or irony that one has in response to that condition. The idea that we should do away with that condition, or that we should totally ignore the suffering of others. I mean, like, I think it's all of the should coming in that feels so dumb. And that, like, the reason I think like the Dorian Lux poem is the least annoying of the three is that it also seems to be the one that comes closest to evoking the emotional experience of living in this kind of tension. Whereas the other ones just seem much bossier. And like, I think Auden's poem is a little cooler and drier, that it's less about sort of stirring up the feeling that is in the plowman or whoever else, but it's an exquisite articulation of this condition. And then I think like another kind of poem that is very much worth writing is the Dorian Lex kind of poem, which is here's what it's like when you have one feeling and then there's another feeling, and both of them have perfectly good reasons behind them, but neither negates the other.
Yeah, here's what it's like. So a poem ends up doing work much closer to that of a painting than a protest song. And that's so much better work for it to do. Otherwise, now you have two problems. You have a poem that's not quite working, and you have a job to do after you've read it. Mostly that job is to feel bad because you're not going to actually do anything.
Yeah, I felt that a little bit reading the Kaminsky poem where he says, even at the beginning, we protested but not enough. We opposed them but not enough. And I kind of want to say, like, so what did you do? so what did you do that didn't work? Because it sounds like you just wrote poems about it, or you posted about it. Like, okay, fine.
Can I read you this little bit of Yeats that I found?
Yeah.
Do you know On Being Asked for a War poem?
It rings a bell. I know I've read it, but I don't have any real memory of it. So please read it.
I'd never come across it before. I just found it yesterday. It's only 6 lines. I think it better that in times like these a poet's mouth be silent, for in truth we have no gift to set a statesman right. He has had enough of meddling, who can please a young girl in the indolence of her youth, or an old man upon a winter's night.
I don't know if I have read that. Yeah. I think he's
so
pretty right.
Get in, get out.
Yeah.
6 lines.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a hard time arguing with that. I mean, there are, Yeats, of course, wrote wonderful war poems, but they tend to be poems, they tend to be lyrics that get at some of the experience of living in a war or loving people who were involved in a war, or having some, felt relationship to the events of a war. I mean, they're not, even like Easter 1916, which waves a little bit of a flag, it's ambivalent about the politics.
Poems may well affect change in the world on people, on individual people, maybe on whole groups of people. But the minute they try to, at best it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But we can't let it go. We just cannot let this go. Like, as a class of people, poets, just anytime anything happens, catastrophic, cataclysmic, or significant in any way, we're like, I need to apply my art to this thing. Let's just embrace irrelevance, guys.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think that's hard. It's hard for Americans to do, but like, it's hard to say, this is terrible, I'm going to do nothing, which is what we are almost always going to do. Definitely,
you don't have to do nothing. You could do all kinds of things.
You can, yeah.
And just leave your poems out of it.
And God bless people who do, but there will never be a moment when there is not horrible suffering happening somewhere. And even if you devote all of your time to addressing horrible suffering somewhere, most of the time when you learn about horrible suffering, you will still do nothing. Because you're going to be doing it elsewhere. So, like, the idea that, like, if you're going to spend much of your life writing poetry, that you should also be reacting every time you find out someone's suffering is just fucking incredibly, like, geocentric as a way of thinking.
I wanted to ask you, too, like, you're basically a year in, you're nearly 50 episodes in. How does it feel?
Fine. Feels fine.
What?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure how it's supposed to feel. I don't.
Do you feel like you've achieved something? Do you still enjoy doing it?
I do enjoy it. I definitely have not achieved anything. Can I compare with you? Because I occasionally will go sniffing to see if there are any other brethren out there, and I scroll through I mostly just through Apple Podcasts, because that's what I mostly listen on. I will like put in poetry and then scroll through the gajillion different podcasts that are listed, including yours. But no, I realized like today I was thinking like I've narrowed it down to like a set of like a checklist that I look for to determine whether or not something is worth. Because I'll like, it's like I've discovered some things that way, and I've reached out to some people. But boy, there are precious few good poetry podcasts. I mean,
yeah, everybody just makes the same show. Yeah,
holy shit. And that's what I realize like my also probably closed-minded criteria are either an extremely austere or sort of weird or like anti cover design. Like what I don't want is like anything that looks pretty or nice or like it could also be a parenting podcast,
Oh, Jesus, fuck, yeah.
And then like episodes that are longer than 3 minutes long, because all those are, but most of them, and those are all just they reading poems. And then
such a waste of time.
Such a waste of time, yeah. Then I look for the E for explicit, right? Because like just like that people are willing to say a curse word is like, you just put this like, which again, like I'm sure there are plenty of clean language podcasts that are great, but it like that's my Tinder dog whistle I'm looking for. And then, I think it's mostly like in the title or in the descriptive language, if there's anything that suggests even the slightest grain of ambivalence about poetry. Like if it's anything that's not just pure enthusiasm or warmth for all of poetry and humanity. I found one that looked really promising based on the cover design and the grittiness of the show description until I got to the last line, which was, and in this way, help all people, including myself, become a better servant to our Lord Jesus Christ. Like, well, that's again like there are good podcasts by Christians about poetry. Seldom are they like good podcasts that are trying to use poetry to make everybody be Christian. Like that's maybe that's where you lose me a little bit. Anything else I should be any other secret signifiers I should be looking for when I?
No, you've got a great list there for sure. But to be honest with you, I don't really. Part of me doesn't want to find another good poetry podcast because I don't want to know that I have to lift my game again. I'm pretty comfortable doing what I'm doing, and so I don't want to find someone who's like doing something transcendently good. But it's just the formula is so there in the same ways with parenting podcasts or whatever. It's just like, here's a poem, isn't it amazing? Poetry's the best, because there's this all-pervasive thought that poetry needs help, and needs to be defended and needs to be like boosted. Poetry doesn't give a fuck.
I mean, which is like any podcast about anything, any like review section, any like commentary on any subject that people take even remotely seriously can be critical and irreverent because the thing's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere.
We treat poetry like it's a fucking Make-A-Wish kid. Like it's the worst.
I really don't listen to that much. I basically just listen to your show, and I listen to a little bit of like the London Review of Books one, because they're very knowledgeable, and like I learn things about British poetry that I didn't know otherwise. It's like good on you for going out there and trying to find stuff.
I found a few, and there's some that are more promising than others, but I'll like listen to a few episodes, and in most cases it's just like, well, they're just not very funny. Which is like you don't have to be funny, but they're trying to be funny, and they're not that funny. The disappointment has been like I found a handful that are setting out to do a thing that I'm interested in, and that is at least sort of in the same neighborhood. But my observation has been in most cases that they're just not very good at it. With like a possible exception that I actually reached out to them, and we'll see how things go. I guess I'm talking to you right now. I can tell you and then just cut this. But there's so it's a weird little American podcast called Breaking Form that is two middle-aged poets who are like, I hesitate to like I'm struggling to find any way to accurately describe their personae other than just sassy gays, because it just seems to be so heavily what they are doing. Like they're so much performing this particular kind of role, which is very like great. I mean, and part of what's wonderful about it is that it brings a tartness and an edge to the conversation. It is in some cases like so weirdly graphically specific in discussions of sex and comparing poetry to sex that it feels like, all right, strong medicine that like doesn't always land, that like, or doesn't always, maybe I don't have quite the right temperament or perspective to be like, to find it funny enough. But, like, even the fact that they would like play a game where they would try to determine which poets were tops and which were bottoms, and like in doing like across the centuries and the genders and so forth, right? Like, so like they, again, like they're going for something that I appreciate. They are quite they do get extremely pious about basically like anything that like the progressive left is pious about at the moment. And so that sort of gets a little stiff and takes some of the fun out of it. But they're relatively new. So like just that they're sort of going after something like that makes me think like, well, I reached out to the guy and like had all this specific praise for him, and his response was he like responded really relatively quickly and nicely. And he said, yeah, we're quite busy at the moment. Let's try back in the fall. This is like 2 months ago I wrote him. I was like, the fall? Like, I might be dead by, like, what are you talking about, the fall? Like, motherfucker. Like, I will take a bet on whether you will still be doing this shit in the fall. But
Yeah. What the hell? Some people are so precious. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Maybe they want time to like figure out whether you're okay because you're a straight white guy. They want to know if you're like worth their time.
Could be, yeah. Or just, or I may just be too small time, because that tends to be.
I don't get the sense that you're small time anymore. I get the sense that you're.
But I think like Jonathan has talked about the experience of going to a conference and wearing a name tag that lists your affiliation and your status basically, and that it is
Jesus.
Yeah, it's a very straightforward process of like going around the room and having people read your name tag and make decisions about whether or not to talk to you. And that does feel
gross.
like the American poetry world is only a slightly muted version of that out in the world. It's like it's different from that only insofar as people are not wearing name tags that are quite as easily legible. But like that is still the way people tend to operate around each other in the American poetry world.
Yeah, because everyone thinks they have a career.
That was my conversation with Alice Allan of the podcast Poetry Says. You can find her on Twitter at poetry_says. You can reach me at sleerickets@gmail.com or on Twitter at sleerickets, where somebody will answer your tweet, or maybe Brian will just start a feud with another former guest. In any case, thank you all so much for listening. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.